Hi everyone, welcome to our past 10 Pound for Camp YA. Super excited to be talking about some historical fiction today. We have got some amazing authors with us. I'll introduce them all and let them say a little bit about themselves, the books they write, and anything else they'd like to tick off. First up, we've got Amy McCaw, who is the writer of Mina and the Undead, which is an absolutely fantastic YA novel. Amy, do you want to say a couple of words?
Oh, well, thanks for that. It's a lovely introduction. So Wood and Kat Dunn is my debut novel. It's a YA murder mystery set in 1995 New Orleans. And Mina has just gone to the city to visit her sister, and she's getting all wrapped up in the spooky things that the city has to offer. She even gets a job in a horror movie mansion. And things are going great until she finds a dead body at work, and she realizes that someone is killing people in the style of local legends, and she has to figure out what's going on before she becomes the next victim.
So good. Such a good book. If you've not read it yet, would highly advise picking
Thank
it
you.
up. Then we have got Laura Wood, author of many books, but I'll just name my favorite, which was Under a Dancing Star. Laura, do you want to say a couple of things about yourself and your books?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for that, Beth. That's really nice, and I can see my books up above your head, which is really lovely. There they are. So I'm Laura, and I write YA historical fiction, which I guess makes me perfect for this panel. My three YA books that are out at the moment are set in the 20s and 30s. My new book, which comes out in October, A Single Thread of Moonlight, is set in 1899. So I'm absolutely obsessed with historical fiction and so happy to be on this panel.
Can't wait for your next one. That's going to be so good. And then we've finally got Kat Dunn, who is the author of the very fantastic Dangerous Remedies. Is it going to be a trilogy? Is it?
Mhm.
Yeah, trilogy. So, so good. That first book absolutely gripped me, and I cannot wait to start the second one. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, Kat?
Thank you for the introduction. I am Kat Dunn. My debut as Dangerous Remedy, as Beth said. I've managed to remember to hold the prop this time. It came out last year, and the second in the trilogy, Monster Design, came out this June this year. It's set during the French Revolution. Me, my girlfriend Ada, and their sort of ragtag band of exiles rescue people from the guillotine, Scarlet Pimpernel style. Only the latest person they've been hired to rescue, when they find her, she's not an aristocrat like they've been told, and she's not exactly human either. And thus unfolds much adventures and stabbing and betrayal and explosions and kissing and that sort of fun stuff. And then there's just more of it, two more books, but it gets more exciting, I promise.
It's so good. The way you just straight into the action is just amazing. Cool. We've got some questions that we're going to be asking, as well as any questions from anyone watching. I'm just gonna throw these out to you guys, and then if you've got a particular answer, just jump straight in. I feel like the first question is probably the most typical question to ask when you think of historical fiction, but I'm going to ask it anyway. If you could go back in time safely for a week, where and when would you go back to, and why?
I've got one for this. My book is mostly set in the 90s, so it's not very exciting to go back to that. So I like to go kind of to the American West, like the gold rush. I've always been really fascinated with Westerns and that idea of setting a society up completely from the start and it being lawless and people making their own rules. And I love all the kind of gunslingers, cowboys. I think it's all really cool. And especially if I can be alive through all the like gunfights and disease, that would just be perfect. So yeah, like that, I'd go to probably like maybe 1848. I think it was the gold 49ers and the gold rush. So yeah, then in America, in California.
Nice.
That's such a good answer. I think I would really like to go to like the 1920s, so late 1920s, because I think it's just such a cool and interesting time. But I also think now we have this view of that period of interwar period as having this kind of fragility, um, and being this very slender moment between the wars. But I'd love to know what it felt like to actually experience living through that when you weren't experiencing it as the interwar years, when you were just experiencing it as the post-war years, and maybe kind of before before things start to get really bad again. that would be such a fun time to experience. And I think that's why I wrote my first kind of set of historical YA novels in that period, because there's so much good stuff, like the fashion and the music and the parties and that kind of decadence, but also the kind of giddy relief. I feel like maybe in a hopefully post-COVID world, we'll have that moment as well, of that sort of giddy relief of coming out the other side of something so big and so terrible. So I think that would be interesting.
You've both given incredibly clever answers, and in my head I've been going, oh God, where would I go? And I realized what I would want to do is, you know, those coach tours that go around Europe and take about a month and go to every single place for half a day, mostly populated by Australians. I want to do that. Please put me on a coach and drive me through about 60 different times and places. I honestly, picking one place would be so hard, but I think I've always the books Dangerous Remedy and the trilogy are the French Revolution, but I've always been drawn to a slightly later period, from the 1850s to 1900. That sort of transition into what is quite recognizable modernity, I've always found incredibly fascinating since I was a kid, and I think I would just love to go wander around Dickensian London and probably be slightly annoyed about how similar so much of it is, and be like, oh well, this isn't much of a historical holiday. But I think that world is so close to being able to touch it. There's so much that still remains. There's so much that's recognizable. There's so much that's documented, and yet it is the past. So you can't know, and you can't fully understand what that was like, and it just feels so frustrating, like it's on the other side of a very thin curtain, and I would just love to pull it back.
Those are all fab answers, and also different as well. I always think it's such an interesting question to see where everyone will go and why. Everyone's always got a really interesting answer to it. So thank you for those ones, guys. I realized, by the way, I didn't introduce myself for anyone watching thinking, who is this person interviewing everyone? I'm a content creator. My name's Beth. You can find me at Books Nest, Instagram and YouTube, my main platforms. Just in case you're thinking, who is this person asking these questions? But now I'll move on to the next question. So obviously historical fiction isn't all the truth and is based on some truth. So when you were writing, was there anything that didn't quite fit with what you were writing within the past that you had to kind of change a little bit to suit your story? Laura, I'm gonna throw that one at you. You look like you were
I was just trying to think if that was the case. I mean, Kat and I did a historical fiction panel a while ago, and spent quite a lot of time talking about how concerned and worried we are about being accurate and getting things right. Actually, my instinct is much more to worry about me fitting into what was happening. So I can't really think of anything where I guess like there's a modern sensibility to the books, which is something that I felt like just felt right about writing the books now for a reader now. So sometimes I think people can pick up my book set in the 20s and 30s and think, oh, something about this can feel a bit modern. But so some people don't like that, but for me that was very intentional, because I feel like I have no interest in writing about the kind of, I guess, unless you're going to unpick it in an important and interesting way, I've got no interest in writing about like the sort of bigoted past, for example, as just a sort of background noise. So there's definitely a modern sensibility in those terms, but I don't think there's like an event or anything like that that I kind of have yet had to sort of swerve around. But also, I guess my fiction, historical fiction, which is slightly unusual for YA, I think is I guess a sort of realist historical fiction, where it doesn't have the kind of fantasy elements in. So in some ways, I think I feel maybe a bit more restricted by the rules in that sense, and I find the idea of writing a historical fantasy so enticing, because A, I absolutely love reading them, and B, I think or I would hope it makes you feel, these two books makes you feel a bit more free to kind of play with that sort of stuff.
Nice. I would definitely read that.
So would I.
Sorry, Kat, what were you going to say?
Oh, I was just gonna be like, yeah, guilty as charged. I'm already messing around so much with how the logic of electricity works in the book. So I'm a bit like, do I have to make all the things accurate? I mean, I've always been that person as a reader and as someone who consumes historical fiction, like in films and TV, and who's always been really annoying to be like, they wouldn't have that then, and I didn't want to. I struggle with that writing because my desire is to be like pinpoint accurate, but then I think you have to step back and go, well, what is the point of what you're writing, right? Like there are things around accuracy that help create a world, and there are things that are not that you just don't need to tie yourself to that. I mean, I'm not trying to create a historical document. I'm not trying to create a reenactment of the past. So I think that's where I've always drawn the line. I've always wanted to stay accurate around the things that make life look like food and clothing and the place you'd live in and the streets you're walking around in. And then if I need this famous church to explode 2 months later than it did, then I'll nip that, or I'll take a historical event. And in the first book, there's a thing called the Festival of the Supreme Being, which was a real festival held by Robespierre, kind of at the point where his power is about to. Everyone starts to look at each other and go, maybe this guy's a bit unhinged. And I took that and obviously changed what happened there. So I think you're always kind of, by writing historical fiction, you are not documenting something that accurately happened. So you're always engaged somehow in falsifying the past. But then I'm going to stop there because I can go into a massive philosophical rant about what is the past, and is it not just the story we write about it? So are we falsifying? Anyway, I'll see that for a later question.
The panel. Amy, how about you?
So, because I remember my time period mostly, there were segments set in the 1930s which I don't remember. But for the 90s, a lot of the clothes and the music I was listening to and the films all still feel very present. So when I heard that this was historical fiction, I had to think, yeah, actually, I grew up in a historical time period now. So that I got really bogged down with things like, well, I think you'll find Interview with the Vampire came out in November. Therefore, Mina must have seen it at this point, and she saw it at the cinema, and then it wouldn't be out on video yet. So these things took me hours to figure out. But the stuff that I did change, it was a bit of a turning point in terms of technology of the mid-90s, in terms of the internet and mobile phones. Like some people had mobiles, some didn't. Like a lot of your everyday person, it sounds like didn't have internet access, didn't have access to mobile phones. And I know I didn't. And that really served my plot, because a lot of the plot is them trying to figure out, could this person be killing people in the style of myths? And if they just typed in the keywords from the myth, it would have told them the answer straight away on Google. So the internet had to go, just the internet doesn't exist yet. And also police procedure. I spent a lot of time researching in fine detail and then completely throwing it all out because it just wouldn't have worked. Like, what do you mean fingerprints took like a week to come back in the 90s? That's not acceptable. I need it like that day. So some of that I did have to I interviewed a police officer about all of it, and then unfortunately had to shape a lot of what he said to fit the narrative. So I'd some of the stuff that he told me not to do, I did it anyway, because it just needed to for the plot. It would have been too slow. Like I couldn't have the book take 3 months because they had to send the DNA off to Washington or something. So yeah, my little police station in New Orleans had to do a lot that they wouldn't have been able to do probably.
Interesting. It's interesting to know like the kind of decisions you have to make around it. And yeah, I suppose this is quite convenient with the internet kind of just seeping in there for you. Amy.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Kat, this one is specifically for you. So obviously your book's set in France during quite a challenging time. You've written such a compelling and gripping story, and you're immediately thrown into the action, which I absolutely love. Did you find it challenging to not only write about a different time period, but also a different culture and country at such a difficult time in their history?
Yeah, there's quite when you list it all out like that, you're like, oh, there's a lot of things going on there. There's a lot of things to balance. I think the biggest challenge I found as somebody who, as I said, is that massive nerd who wants to write about every historical detail in a plot that's so action focused. You just can't do that. And a lot of what was cut out of my early drafts was some of that focus on the detail that just got in the way, and that really broke my heart in a way to cut out. But I'm not writing like a Hilary Mantel big tome. I'm trying the way that you write about the period does have to fit the story, as Amy and Laura have both said. So I balanced it, I suppose, by in one way coming down heavily in favor of the story every time. I think writing about another culture is always a great responsibility. I have very close family ties with France, and I've spent large chunks of my life there, so I felt a certain familiarity. But at the same time, France of the Revolution is, as you know, England of the time would be to us now, was a very different world, and was, you know, it's hard to kind of emphasize how much the Ancien Regime that had survived to that point wasn't like the royalty that we think of from, you know, Austin or something. It was like old feudal monarchy. Like, it was, they had not had those sorts of changes. So trying to actually envisage that culture was a whole challenge in and of itself. And yeah, trying to balance all that when really the focus of the story had to be pace at every single turn. It meant really kind of focusing on the smallest details that could kind of try and convey and build that atmosphere without detracting from the pace. Greatest thing I think lost is some of the detail of the political situation that had to go, but was just too complicated to explain in a 90,000 word YA. I would love to write a really long, sprawling adult one that goes into all the details.
Amazing, thank you. So this one's back for everyone again. Was there anything that surprised you when researching the time period of your book? Anything you didn't know about, or anything that when you researched into it was actually a lot more than you ever thought it would be?
I think for me, like I said, the 90s period was no surprise. And I just had to check that my memory of things was correct, because I think you can sometimes rewrite your own history, like, and think you did something in one year, but it actually didn't happen then at all. So that was fine. The 1930s, I had to do quite a bit of research, because although they're really short extracts of a diary, I just wanted to make sure that things were right. But for me, it was more the culture of New Orleans that I found really surprising and fascinating when I went there. There's a reason that when a ghost story, people would say, "Oh, there's this story, and you know, this person supposedly died there," and it's quite throwaway, and it doesn't feel like it really happened, or we know that it did. It's been changed years that it's probably not anything like the real story. But in New Orleans, there's this feel that the stories feel very present, and people say things to you like, "I saw the Carter," which is one of the myths mentioned in the book. I know somebody who saw them on a balcony, and you think, "Oh, really?" You know, you actually know somebody who has actually been involved in this myth, and people say things like, "I think I sat next to a ghost on the trolley once," and I just found that really interesting. That it doesn't feel in the UK, certainly where I'm from, that sort of blending of fact and fiction and mythology and truth. It doesn't feel like that's a time period that we live in. So I loved that, and that was something that I played around a lot with, like, were you dealing with a human serial killer, or were you dealing with something that we kind of consider mythical? And yeah, I just loved playing around with that.
Nice. Laura, what about you?
Well, I think in the most recent one, there were a couple of things that I found really interesting and that I found surprising. So the first thing was the book is set in 1899, and when I was, so like Kat was talking about wanting to go to Dickensian London earlier, and that was, you know, that the first part of the book is set in London, and it was so much fun because I really got to lean into that Dickensian London, like foggy street lamps and the whole works. That was really fun. And one of the things that I did find surprising when I was researching was that there was film footage of London at that time. So the BFI film player, you can just go onto their website and it's free to watch. And they have all this black and white silent footage of London street scenes in the 1890s. And you can see like people you can see the traffic and the omnibuses and the horses and the people, and you can see people, especially there's lots of scenes with working class people where they're all sort of crowding around the camera because they're so excited that it's there and see it. And you know, it completely blew my mind that you could do that. I think it's what Kat was saying about how close that period specifically, I think, because it's on the edge of that sort of modernisation, it feels so close and so far away at the same time. So I just think it's incredible to have access to that sort of and what a gift as a writer when you're trying to give an impression of like what walking down a busy London street would be like, to be able to actually see that happening in front of you. So I found that really surprising and incredible and peaceful, and I would 100% recommend link out of your time to the BFI website, check those out. And then the other thing that I found really exciting, I haven't been able to get out of my head, which I think I'm probably means I'm going to have to write something about it at some point, is I ended up doing some side research into Devonshire House Ball, which happened in 1897, I think. Because the first ball that my character goes to is at Devonshire House, and there's this really throwaway line like, "Oh, the site of the infamous Devonshire House Ball." And behind that line is me losing like a week of my life to research about this particular ball, because again, the resources that are available to anyone who wants to look into it are unbelievable. It was a huge fancy dress ball, and they had essentially a photo booth, and they hired a photographer to take professional photos of everyone in their full, incredibly fancy dress costumes. So you can, I think it's National Portrait Gallery have got the archive of it. Again, online, you can look, and there's hundreds of pictures of women dressed as Valkyries and men dressed as Cavaliers, and the costumes of people are just incredible, and it's so crisp and sort of present, and you can see the kind of enjoyment that people are having, but also like the level of decadence is incredible. Like there's one costume that a man's wearing that was designed by Charles Worth, who's like a huge fashion designer in that period, and it just cost thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of francs, because it's covered in like lace and embroidery and jewels, and you can see it all in the photograph. And to me, that kind of almost tactile relationship with the person, with clothing, and with the people, I just find that so thrilling. So that was one that I would also recommend losing some time to.
They both sound really interesting. I want to go have a look now. Kat, how about you? What surprised you most when researching the time period?
I've been spending this whole time thinking, trying to, and I don't think there's any one very specific thing, but I think the thing that really struck me when researching, and kind of I thought about this when Laura was talking about being able to look at footage of Victorian London, is that the Paris of the Revolution does not exist anymore. The Paris as we know and like imagine it today is a confection of about the 1830s, when Haussmann was commissioned by Bonaparte, well, the current, well, I get a bit fuzzy after the revolution, let's not admit that. But basically, the Paris that we know today was designed in the early 19th century, and it bulldozed vast swathes of Paris that had come before. So it was really jarring to have to kind of throw away what your mental image of Paris is. And I think a lot of us have this kind of very romanticized image, and I just had to get rid of it. And then you're kind of trying to pick through like old line drawings and someone's paintings and this map to try and put together a city that's half vanished. And so it was quite, I think that's what I found the most sort of surprising, was just how vanished so much of that. And even the major places from the revolution have half vanished. So it's not like I can do even a walking tour of Paris of all the places I do. And I situated my gang day out some rooms over the top of a restaurant called the Petit Suisse and opposite Luxembourg, because that was one of the things I found that existed. It was founded the year that my book was set, and I was like, right, that existed in that location, and I can find this spot on a map, and then I know where I am. Because I really wanted the story to feel quite grounded in the city. So I spent so much time kind of looking at, there's this amazing old map called the Turgot map of Paris, and probably getting that one wrong, but it's a map from the previous century, or earlier in the 18th century, where it is drawn to such detail that you can see every single house and tree, every single street. So it was kind of my Google Maps, and that's what I had to go off for this vision of the city. And like, yeah, that was quite a strange experience, and not what I expected at all when I sort of set out to kind of really understand what place was I was writing about.
Interesting. Yeah, that must be quite we've changed so much. Yeah, in such a amount of time, I suppose as well. Interesting. Okay. Well, thank you. Amy, we've got one just for you now. So obviously your book is set in New Orleans, which I just became very much obsessed with after reading the book because there's so much, it's so interesting, and you've already mentioned everything that's happened there and the way it differs from our own history in the UK. But you've also obviously got the fantasy element being involved kind of in it, like the mention of things. And that's kind of merging some histories together, I suppose. Can you talk us through your research for the book? I bet it was pretty fun. I mean, you've already spoken a bit about it, but I bet that was fun to research into.
It was so fun, and I bought so many books. When I was in New Orleans, so I visited in 2012, and that's when the first idea. And I took many books home with me. My suitcase was absolutely stuffed with them. So I think the first for my research was taking just photographs of places that I loved, and a lot of the real places in the book, like the actual pharmacy museum, and they, have beignets outside this amazing cathedral. Like a lot of that is grounded in that first visit that I did. So that was my first research. And then when I decided I was going to do this book, my research became very broad. So I read loads of news articles, and I wasn't sure when I was going to set it. So I thought at first it might be present day. And then I found this article that said that 1995 was the deadliest year in New Orleans history. And that headline just stopped me in my tracks. And I thought, well, what does that mean? And it meant that I think it's something like 426 people were murdered. And I thought, what an awful statistic, like more than a person a day died in that one city. And it was also the year just after Into the Vampire came out. So I kind of combined those two things in my head. What if this vampire subject matter was bringing loads of tourists to the city, which actually apparently the locals hated in some ways? It made them loads of money, but it was quite annoying seeing all these tourists like descending on them. So there was that element. And then there was this real violent, like current situation that the people living in. So that was my starting point. And then it was a lot of talking to people, looking at my own photographs. And I actually found somebody who lives in New Orleans now. And she went and took lots of photographs of things like, what do the fences look like outside that building? And my photograph of this convent that ended up being quite a big scene. I'd taken really rubbish photos of it. She went for me and took pictures from all these really specific angles that I wanted. Like, what does that corner look like? And what's down that street? Because like the others are saying, it was those little details that I didn't want to get bogged down in, but I really wanted you to feel that heat of the city, what it's like in New Orleans in summer, where it feels like the heat is dripping off you. And everywhere you look, it's a city on like multiple levels, because you're looking up at these amazing balconies with, plants sort of hanging down over you. And the streets, some of them are cobbled, some of them are horrendously cracked, so you're tripping up. And I just wanted all of that to be in there. So I think my research started really broad and started from, the New Orleans of my head. And then it just became from the factual research and then the myths. I mean, like Kat said, I could talk for hours about reading New Orleans mythology. I had this kind of the real New Orleans in my head, the one that I'd been to, and the 90s New Orleans that I was writing about, and then incorporating these myths, which to the people of the city are their kind of history and the stories they tell. I did a lot of research into that, and I tried to stick to the facts of those in inverted commas as much as I could, but there's so many versions. So in some of them I had to just like pick my path through it that served my story the best. So yeah, it was absolutely amazing writing it. I kind of wish I could do all that again because I loved it. I really enjoyed the research.
I think you did such a good job of capturing the
Thank
atmosphere.
you.
So those photos definitely did the job with making it feel grounded. It was, yeah, really good. Cool. Okay. So when I look at books and review books and stuff, one of the instant things I think about is feminism and the way that the women are represented. And I love a good, strong female lead, which all of your books have. So looking at how women have been treated throughout different periods of time, and you've each got a different part of history in your books, so hopefully we'll get some varied answers here. But how did this play a role in creating the female leads? Because sometimes with YA we kind of make the more bold, and some of them would have been, some of them would have still had that kind of oomph to them. And how did you want your women leads portrayed against the men in your books? Because I think you've all done it very differently. So it'd be interesting to grab some answers there.
Start everybody else thinking. So in the 90s when I was a teenager, I think that was the time period where I first understood feminism, understood that maybe you grow up thinking that, there are boys and girls, but everybody's kind of the same. I think as you're a teenager, start to unpick like the complexities of relationship, complexities of identity. So I think I try to think about that, like what it like for me growing up and kind of navigating those situations. And I was really mindful. I remember Samantha Shannon at an event I saw years ago saying that she always thinks, like the background people in a scene or roles of responsibility and power. She said that it's interesting how your go-to is often imagining a man because you think about like the male police officer, like the books I read to my little boy, the amount of times it's a police man and it's a picture of a man, and so on. So I'm there saying police officer, he's one, so he doesn't know I've just changed it. So I think that all of that was in my head, that I don't just want, two male police detectives. The dominant, very confident police detective is a black female officer. And the kind of young, inexperienced guy who's got a lot to learn is a white man. And I sort of did that very deliberately, that I wanted her to be the guiding force and her to be the very strong mind. And the same in the friendship group. I think that Mina is sort of figuring out who she is and figuring out her relationships with her sister. And she's surrounded by these very strong, confident women who really know who they are and are really secure, like her sister and her girlfriends. They're both secure in their relationship and secure in their identities. And I think that was really great to explore, because Mina it's particularly the start of the book, she's a bit less certain of that. So yeah, it's interesting that you asked that, Beth, because it was something that was really at the forefront of my mind when I was writing. So I'm glad it came through to some extent.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, it's interesting to hear how you think about it, because as a reader, I've just read the front side of that, and then there's all this thought going into it as well. So it definitely came across.
Yeah, I was struck by something you're saying about the patriarchy, the imagination, I suppose, kind of inbuilt filter that we end up with from growing up in society. And I do remember as a teenager, when I was writing then, I was struck one day by realizing that whenever I started a new story, I kind of thought, and there's this boy and he goes and does this, and I'm like, wait, why? And so and sort of since then, I've always very deliberately written female leads, and that was no different when I came to start this same sort of Dangerous Remedy series. And I think, particularly in the time period, it was a very interesting one to try and write, because what we remember of the revolution is a history written again by the patriarchy, and there were so many women involved that you just never heard of. And the more I read into it, the more you kind of understand that there was a whole women's revolution happening at the same time. It's just not entered the popular imagination. So one of the characters is named after a woman called Alam de Gouges, who at that time very famously wrote, so there was a Declaration of the Rights of Man that was kind of a seminal document at the start of the French Revolution, and she wrote Declaration of the Rights of Woman, going, excuse me, can't just like we all have freedom apart from you, So there was this whole other, the kind of political life. Sorry, I'm going to babble so much just this topic, but the political life was so much had happened in the forefront beforehand, which I think a lot of people also don't realise, is that it was incredibly hierarchical society and a massively run by the aristocracy and by the king. But it happened in salons, which were run by the women. They were run by the women of the household, and the wife would be to have kind of as much influence on her husband as anyone else. And that was actually one of the things that people like Rousseau were writing against. They were like, what are these women doing up in our business? And if you look at some of the texts that you kind of automatically assume, oh, this is sort of a new philosophical text, it must be moving in the right direction. And actually something like Rousseau is all like, but women should be in the kitchen, right? We all know that, right? And this is the problem with France, is they're all up there helping make decisions. And so you actually have some kind of quite reactionary ideas on the left and on the kind of revolutionary side that sort of, anyway, that I think that was something that I found really fascinating when I read more and more into the revolution, and was trying to situate my characters in that kind of political discourse. So I'm just trying to not go on for a million years, but you see women in the revolution right from women of the aristocracy, women in the kind of bourgeoisie. Obviously Marie Antoinette is the most famous woman of the revolution, but really played almost the smallest role compared to some of the other women that have been lost to history. I mean, we remember Marat was like stabbed in the bathtub, but do we remember that it was anything about Charlotte Corday who did it? No. And there's also there was obviously such a huge movement of working class people in the revolution that, you know, were at the forefront of it. And of course, so were working class women who just don't get talked about. And so one last massive run, because I realize all I'm doing is info dumping things I researched. But we think of the falling of the Bastille as, like, you know, the huge seminal moment of the revolution. But there, so was the storming of the Versailles, which is where, you know, several thousand women, you know, poor women of Paris just went, actually, bugger this for a game of soldiers, turned around, marched on Versailles, and were like, I think the king should just get out of there now. I think you should come back to Paris, which is a gross simplification. But that was just as huge and seminal a moment where Versailles was racked. Things were smashed. People flooded the palace. It was a huge thing. So I don't know what the point of all this is, but yeah, the patriarchy in how we remember history. And I created my characters quite deliberately in kind of conversation with all of that, and I could go on for like another whole panel about this, but
It's my favorite topic to talk about. There's a book, I don't know if you've ever read it, called The Women's History of the World, that looks at all the kind of the parts in history that there's just casually forgotten the women involved. And I think everything you were saying there was like, there's so many moments that women are involved in that you just see women painted as these really timid creatures beyond so far into history. And there's so many bold moments that we just seem to be forgotten across time for having.
But you actually see the purposeful destruction of the legacy. So Olympe, the Gouge, her son was so ashamed of that. So she ended up being put into a psychiatric facility because she was so radical. And then her son was so ashamed of that. He tried to change his name. He tried to go and strike her writings off record. There's purposeful destruction of women's history.
It's so interesting. We could talk about this for so long. Laura, what about with your books? Because obviously yours are at such an interesting time for women. They're getting so much more than they've ever had before, really, in the 20s, and seeing a whole new side of things. Oh,
Can't hear Laura.
I can't hear you, Laura.
Looks like you're muted.
Yeah, but we can see you're not muted. It was going so well. You could drop out and come back in again. Okay. That's fine. I just need to get to talk about feminism longer. I just love seeing how different people interpret it. I think you're seeing it so much more in YA at the moment as well, particularly, which is amazing because it needs to be talked about more and more so we can normalize it.
Hello?
Yes, you're back.
Go on, you can give us your answer now.
My phones died, so I had to take them out and it's messed everything up now. I'm so sorry.
No worries.
But I was just saying that, like, I've been sitting here listening to these two talk about this stuff, and it's so interesting to me. And I think actually what I was thinking was it's so hard to pick a couple of small things to talk about, because I think, especially with my first three books, there's so much about being a young woman coming of age in that period that the idea of what it means to be a woman and feminism, and in a sort of post-suffrage world, what all of that means is absolutely part of every aspect of it. So, for example, A Sky Painted Gold, which is my first book, one of the things I was really interested in thinking about in that book was the dynamic between the sisters. So the book is told from Lou's perspective. Her sister Alice is a year older than her and has just got married, and is completely happy about that. And Lou imagines a different life for herself, but doesn't, because she hasn't seen that kind of modelled for her, feels like by saying she wants something different, she's rejecting a life that's making her sister and her mother very happy. So I think I felt like that was something that was really important to talk about in the book. For me, it was nice to have this main character who was kind of kicking against conventions, who wanted a bigger life for herself, who was, as you were saying earlier, like a kind of bold female character. But I also didn't want that to be at the expense of the women who, that kind of slightly catty issue of being at the expense of women who chose a different life to that there is value in, and that's, a conversation that she and her sister actually have in the book, which felt really important to me, which was that we just want different things. It's not like one thing is better, it's just different. So, you know, that is one of the issues that I think I was kind of talking about. And then, yeah, all of my 1920s and 30s books are about young women who are kind of trying to work out on the cusp of adulthood what that looks like for them. And for all three of them, that's about what they're going to do next in terms of career or school or you know, that kind of thing. So there's definitely that. I would also say maybe something to add to that conversation for my books is that they're romances. And so when you were asking about like how that works in relationship to the male characters in the book, I think that's something that's particularly interesting, because I would say that as YA writers, as a kind of, I don't think YA is a genre, but the word for whatever YA is, that we have a bad reputation when it comes to our male love interests. And I've always felt like it was really important not to uphold or model that kind of toxic relationship as being something that was desirable. Because I think as a young adult reader, you really are aware that your readers straddle both sides of that you will have adult readers, but you will have younger readers as well. And so I think as a romance writer in particular, I feel like there is an element of responsibility that I have in that. So the male characters in the book kind of do come from that in a sense. And the main way that kind of presents itself, I suppose, is that I'm very interested in writing male characters who are good and kind and nice and still attractive and sexy and desirable and all of those things, and that those two things aren't mutually exclusive. So I suppose like that's one of the ways in which I'm thinking about the kind of male characters through that lens and how they fit into that book.
It's interesting. You do it so well. I think particularly with the way that you have the relationships, and they're just good. They're good relationships. They give good examples, and also I really like what you said about the cattiness and because I think it's really easy to do that and make the catty relationships between other women. But actually the fact that you like, I'm at a stage in my life where all of my friends are getting married and having babies, and I've just bought myself a flat, and that's great. And I've done that alone. And like to see a character in your book that was like, it's okay, I'm okay with doing this. That was like a real like,
Yeah.
it's don't see it often. It was really nice to see that, even though it is a romance as well. You still have that independence. Cool. So I grab a couple more questions. This one could be kind of a nice quick one. So I suppose, Amy, this will be a slightly different type of answer for you given when your book's set. But when you're at school, when you're studying history, what was your favourite period of history to study? And is that the period of history you've written about, Amy? I say this is probably a bit different for you because presumably you weren't studying the 90s as a history.
No, it was the 90s when I was studying history. So yeah, I think for me, it wasn't, I mean, there were particular periods like the ancient Egyptians I got completely obsessed with. I think when I was probably about 11 and read everything that I could find about the subject. And like I said, with the American West, I also got obsessed with the history of medicine when I studied that at GCSE. And you see a little bit of that in Mina and the Undead, because there's a scene in the Pharmacy Museum where Mina's noticing all like the tools from medicine's past and thinking about like the ways that people were treated. So, but I think I've always liked the gruesome stuff in history, which probably comes into my book. So if I can go to a castle and hear about like all the kind of dark and mysterious things that happened there, I'm just really happy. So it maybe isn't necessarily a particular period of history for me, as much as I love going to locations where something has happened, or even just locations from, you know, hundreds or sometimes like 1,000 years ago. Like I went to a castle in Portugal and it was from the year 1000 or something like that, and it's just amazing. And I knew nothing about it, but just walking on those same stones and walking up this wall and looking at the countryside beneath and thinking that people were looking at this 1,000 years ago. I love that. I think that's why I love history so much. And I didn't realize when I started that I was writing history. But yeah, I think that's what it is. I love seeking out interesting details and thinking, being in a place and thinking of all the people that came before. I love it.
Laura, what about you? What was your Favorite period to study?
I remember at school, my favorite period was when we were studying the Tudors, and I absolutely just loved it, the drama and everything. But now I think what's interesting is I realise that kind of GCSE history, like, I mean, maybe it's different now, maybe it's not, but there was such a very specific viewpoint through which we were looking at that history. And, you know, coming off the back of the question, talking about women being erased, I mean, for example, Henry VIII, who obviously everyone studied, there wasn't really a point where anyone was like, Henry VIII was like a terrible, misogynistic, awful man. Like, look at all this. It was all wrapped up in that kind of thing. So, but yeah, I always loved history. And then when I did my PhD, so I did an English literature degree and I did an English literature PhD, but it actually became sort of a history PhD because I'm writing about 19th century and about women reading. So that for me is absolutely fascinating, and it was so much fun to revisit history in that way. I was able to be like, well, what I'm interested in is specifically the women, and what I'm interested in is domestic life and what that really meant. And what you find is absolutely not these kind of this kind of shell-shocked, you know, absolutely prim and proper Victorians. That's not the reality of lived experience. So I always find that element of the kind of historical research, looking at things, so exciting. And I think that now as an adult writer, it's much fun to be able to write historical fiction and to study history in that more kind of self-aware and I guess like evaluating way than you perhaps absorbed information when you were sort of a young teenager.
Nice. Kat, what about you?
Oh, I mean, I could say a lot of things again here. I mean, I think I already said that I was weirdly very specifically into the Victorians as a teenager, despite don't think I ever studied it at school, but I think similarly I was fascinated by the domestic history, and I think I found later on books like I want to say Judith Flanders has written all these books of like the Victorian city and the Victorian home, and that I could read about forever and ever. But I think at school the thing that I got most drawn into was only studied it in passing, but the First World War, and this kind of came in partly through English as well. I got really into Pat Barker's Regeneration trilogy and the poetry of the First World War, and I think it was both the psychological aspect of the sort of the major impact that the First World War had on our understanding of trauma. And you know, Freud had been doing its thing, and then we had a big war, and it was like, oh, hey, okay, maybe trauma is actually a thing that affects humans. And as somebody who experienced a lot of trauma growing up, I think I was quite fascinated to understand how we began to understand human beings and how they react to trauma, and begin to, and how we can help and or fail to help. So I think that thread really fascinated me, but also I was really drawn to, for some reason, in the First World War, there's also quite a lot of queer history tied up into it, or at least a lot of queer themes tend to come out. I mean, obviously, sort of most famously, Siegfried Hastings and Wilfred Owen's potential unconfirmed connection, and you know, in the Regeneration trilogy, this you know, that queer stories are very much part of that. And I think I read a book. I don't know if anyone remembers Lyndon Newbury's book, The Shell House, which probably came out in 2002 or 2003, which is a dual narrative story of a teenage boy in the present day and during the war, and sort of uncovering the war and exploring an understanding of sexuality, and so I think that I was kind of that kind of nexus of different influences really drew me into it. And I think it's one of the sort of doorways I had into queer history, because the more you start digging, I mean, it was the end of the 19th century, turn of the 20th century. Everyone was deeply interconnected in this small, like, literary world, right? So you kind of read and you go, oh, Siegfried Sassoon was actually, you know, knew Robbie Ross, Oscar Wilde's deep friend and possible lover. Oh, there's actually this kind of a complete interconnected history going on that I knew nothing about. And so I think, I mean, the other thing about Dangerous Remedy is there's lots of, you know, strong female characters, but there's also a lot of queer characters. And so I think that for me was like a unintended doorway into exploring a lot of late 19th century, early 20th century. I mean, male queer history, because that's what was accessible at that time. But yeah, that was a real fascinating period.
I have to say, I love the way that you've written in your queer characters, because I think they're just, we're starting to see queer characters just be in the plot. It doesn't need to be like, oh my gosh, look at this, but you know, it's just beautifully integrated in because it's life. And I think you've done such a brilliant way of doing that. I absolutely love all the characters, but yeah, it's
Thank you.
just, yeah, I love the fact that you've got that integrated in brilliantly as well. Okay, Laura, this one is specifically for you. I think we've got time for maybe one or two more. I'm not sure if we've got any audience questions as well. But Laura, your books are absolutely beautiful. Like they're so unique, and I will always be able to just read them intently in like one or two sittings. And obviously, sweeping us away to the 20s and the 30s. You mentioned so many beautiful settings that I can just visualize so well. And I've been intrigued to know, are they real places? Are they based off real places? Or are they entirely fictional? Because I really felt like I was there.
Oh, that's so nice. I mean, what a nice thing to say. Lots of the places are real. So Sky Painted Gold is set in Cornwall, which is my favourite place. That's where my family's from. My grandparents lived there when I was growing up. So I spent like real proper famous five style summer holidays and things down there. So it's a really kind of joyful place for me. Also, I think coming from the Midlands and now at the moment I live in the Midlands again, being as far away from the sea as you can possibly be on the small island that we live on is really depressing. But that features a house which is set on an island which is separated from the land by a causeway, and that's based on St Michael's Mount in Marazion, which is my favourite place. It's something so magic that there's this small island, and when the tide's out, there's this ancient cobbled causeway that you can walk across to get to the island, but then when the tide comes in, you can't, it's like as if the path was never there in the first place, and it's just totally gone. And there's a kind of mirror one in France as well, actually. But so that was, you know, a huge inspiration for me. And Sky Painted Gold, because it's pretty, there's a bit of it that's set in London, but the majority of it is set in Cornwall. So it was very easy to kind of channel my love for the light and the skies and the scenery and everything that's beautiful there. And Under a Dancing Star is set in Tuscany, and that, again, you know, like I've travelled to Italy quite a lot, and I love Tuscany, and so part of the book is set in Florence, and that was really fun because that was, you know, like Kat was saying earlier, like that was, I wanted readers to be able to take the book like a map and walk the routes. So that's very much grounded in reality. The incredible villa that they stay in Tuscany is just a work of complete fantasy and dream. But I guess it's because the book To Do About Nothing prequel, which was in part inspired by my like weird teenage obsession, and I mean obsession, with the Kenneth Branagh film. so it's set in this beautiful Italian villa, and if you ever watch the film, you know, that's a pretty good indication of the sort of setting, and if you do watch the film, you'll understand why would you not want to set a beautiful escapist summer romance in such a place. So yeah, there are often real places that act as inspiration, and I'm very interested in place. So that's why it's so nice to hear you say that you have that experience of reading the book, because I really want people to have that. Like, I think my books are at a slower pace because I'm very interested in stopping and looking around at this kind of sense of location and where the characters are. And I think that the places that the books are set become characters in the book. So yeah, I mean, I've written too many books now, so I want to go into each one and talk about all the different places, but I'm aware of time. But yeah, that definitely there are real places that inspire them, and yeah, it's lovely. It's lovely when people say that they've enjoyed them in that way.
Tusk Villa, yeah, I did have a bit of merge, watched a nothing film version and a fictionalized version from your book. I would happily visit there, but yeah, I mean, it's each of you have got so many different types of book reasons that your books are compelling and fast reads, different reasons. Like you've taken more time in your second stuff, but I just devoured it because it felt so real, which was amazing. So we've got a couple of audience questions as well, and I've got one question of my own to round off with. So someone has asked, is something in history you feel is overwritten about?
I don't feel like anything is, in my opinion. I mean, I haven't read absolutely loads of historical fiction, so maybe you do start to see patterns if you read lots of it. But I feel like everybody who takes a time period or takes a setting will just completely turn it on its head. Like if I set a book where Laura had set it like down in Cornwall, I would write probably the opposite book in a lot of ways, except there'll be lots of kissing and lovely boys in there probably as well. But it would be a completely different book. So I could, I wouldn't obviously like nick all of Laura's ideas, but I could set something at that time period and do something completely different with it. So I kind of think nothing is out of bounds. There are certain things that would pique my interest because I haven't seen them a lot. Like I said, I love the American West. So if I see that, it has the opposite effect. I don't think, oh, it's been overdone. I think, yeah, more, as much of that as I can consume, I will. So yeah, I can't think of anywhere I go, no, I've had enough of that, really.
I think that's true because I think there's also specifically with historical fiction, as someone who loves to read historical fiction, you kind of tend to get really into different periods, and then the more people that are writing in that period, the more excited you are to read that. Like I absolutely love stuff that's set in the Victorian period. So even though there are, so mmany books that people are writing now, as well as the contemporary Victorian fiction that you can read, I think that I don't think, oh well, that's been done. It feels like there can't be enough to satisfy the kind of appetite that I have for it. So I think, it's quite nice in a way, because if you are a historical fiction fan, sometimes the setting or the period can act as a sort of shorthand for directing you towards something that you're going to enjoy.
I mean, I'd agree with both of you for sure, but I think it's always worth saying, it's always worth kind of making the point that there are so many stories that have not been told in any time period, stories of people of color or queer people of all kinds of marginalized identities that have not had the time in the spotlight. And I don't think you can call any trope done or period overwritten until everyone's had a fair crack at it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it sounds like generally the consensus is everyone writes differently, and everyone's going to, as much as everyone's going to write a different story, everyone's also going to read a different version of each story, I think, as well. You never read a book the same as someone else. So
I think what Kat says is really interesting and important, because if you're in a position where you can say, oh, this has been overdone, or there's too much about this, when there are still marginalized or excluded voices, then what you're saying is you're dismissing that as being unimportant or not part of that. So I think that's such an important point to make as well.
Definitely. Yeah, I think there's always going to be more to achieve, isn't there? And more to spread as much as we can about marginalized voices and talking about what needs to be talked about with it all, which I think we're seeing popping up more and more, which is fantastic. So I don't know if I've got time for one more question or not, but I'm going to go with one final round-up one. So we've had 3 fantastic authors talking about their amazing books. Obviously, go check out their books if you haven't read them already. They are all like fantastic. They're all genuine 5-star reads from me as well, like brilliant. But for each of you three, I just want to ask what some of your favourite historical fiction books are to recommend, and you're not allowed to say each other's.
That's my answer, Dan. Genuinely true as well. For me, I've just read Reputation recently by Lex Croucher, which I absolutely loved. So
Yeah.
good. And what we've been saying about being historically accurate, but I think it might be you, Laura, that said about viewing things through a modern lens. It does that absolutely brilliantly. And again, there are people of colour and queer relationships. And I think that it does a really good job of broadening the view of what has been so narrow in terms of what's been represented at that time period. So yeah, I love that. And the Diviners books by Libba Bray, I think came out quite a while ago now. But they're historical. I think I read them ages ago, so maybe set in the 1920s. And I liked the fact that they're historical, but with a really interesting paranormal slant, which is something I always look for. So yeah, definitely those I would recommend too.
I really loved Reputation as well when I read that recently. I thought that was great, and I felt like that was doing something quite exciting in a and in maybe in a sort of way that will open up. I guess like hopefully there will be more of it, like we were just talking about. I hope that starts a bit of a trend in that kind of historical fiction. I loved the Dark Days Club trilogy by Alison Goodman, which is like incredible Regency sort of fantasy, brilliant trilogy of books, which I really loved. And if I want romance, Eva Ibbotsson's historical fiction is literally unbeatable, the most beautiful romances, and really classic historical fiction. I like Georgette Heyer. She'll always be a huge read for me. She's very important writer to me as a teenager and still as an adult. She's my absolute comfort read. Like I reread those books as something that when I need something comforting, that's what I turn to.
I mean, I'd probably second all of these recommendations, but the two I will go for are two books that I've read. Well, one that I read this year, one that I read before, but it's two that are coming out this year. So She Who Became the Sun is an adult historical fantasy set in an earlier Chinese dynasty about a retelling of the rise of a particular emperor, and it is just one of the best books I've ever read in my life. It is incredibly beautifully written, but yet just full of all the juiciest tropes. So you're kind of stunned by a beautiful description of landscape, and then there's a scene, and you're like, oh yeah, like this is the good stuff. So it sort of hit me on every single level, and it is it's brilliantly queer and complex and complicated and just an absolute like work of art. I genuinely feel like every single person should go and buy and read this book immediately. And then the other is a YA called The City Beautiful by Aidan Polydorus. I don't think it's got a UK release yet. It's out in the US, and I was very lucky to read an early version of it. But it is a Jewish Gothic fantasy set in Chicago around the World's Fair in about early 1900s, and it's haunting, it's beautiful. He's drawn the setting so well, and I love a good gothic horror sort of story. So that's another one that's out soon, and I would really recommend everyone go and read that as well.
Amazing. Oh, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for answering my questions. I had a couple that we weren't able to get to, but I feel like we got some really good answers there. And I hope that everyone watching learned some good things about historical fiction, has got some good book recommendations. I've jotted down Reputation because that sounds really interesting. I haven't heard of that one, so I'm going to give that one a Google. But it just makes me want to go sit down and read right now, which is what I'm going to go and do after this. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you everyone for watching. I know that these panels are all free, but if you did feel inclined at all to make a donation, you can head to the Camp YA website, and there is a charity link there called Room to Read. And they're a charity supporting girls in third world countries to be able to get an education. So head to the Camp YA website and you can find the link to click through there. And that can be a tiny little donation. Anything will help, I'm sure, but that would be amazing because obviously these have been some fantastic events over the weekend. So thank you so much for coming, everyone, and I guess we'll say goodbye.
Thank you. And thanks so much, Beth. That was
Yeah,
amazing.
thank you,
Yeah,
Beth, and
thank
thanks
you.
everyone for joining.
Yeah,
Thank you, guys.